Thanks, Margaret. Thank you for the invitation here to Kirkwood. As a high school teacher, unlike a lot of people, as a biology teacher, what I have to do is think about evolution all the time. All year, every year, 32 years at Northcott, I had to think about it all the time. And for a lot of folks, you sort of think about evolution, and you might get emotional about it, you might get upset about it, you might be fascinated by it, and then you step back and you're not thinking about it anymore. But I have to think about it all the time. So I've developed a lot of information about evolution. But I don't want to pretend that I know everything. I don't want to pretend that I know everything about God's purpose for our lives either. So I'm just this guy, and I'm going to tell you some things that I've learned. And what I'm hoping for is our purpose for the evening is that we all agree that spiritual practices can include science, because science, to me, is full of awe and majesty and wonderment, and it's as amazing as anything else there is in the universe. Also, I'm going to try to explain very carefully what evolution is, so that we're all on the same page and we all know what definitions we're using, because not everybody uses the same definition. Also, I'm going to try to use humility, because I'm speaking in a church, first of all, to a congregation of folks who don't know me very well. I appreciate family being here and some of my former students. That's nice. But a lot of you don't know me very well, so I don't want you to think that I'm speaking on behalf of the entire Presbyterian denomination or anything. I'm just me, and I'm trying to tell you what's happening. Okay. As a science teacher in the classroom, I'm charged with trying to convince students that photosynthesis is real, that cell respiration and enzymes are real, that they really need to know about ecology. And the same is true about evolution. I try to explain what evolution is and try to convince them that something like that is really happening on the earth right now. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes people bring a lot of conceptions about evolution that are different from my own. And sometimes all we can do is agree that the most important thing is to simply understand what scientists are talking about, even if you don't accept it. So sometimes that's as far as I can get. What I'm doing tonight is I'm searching for what I would call resonance of ideas. Now, you might know that word if you're a musician or a physicist or something. Resonance might mean, if you're tuning a piano or a guitar, a tuning fork of a particular frequency will vibrate, and when it's vibrating, then a string in the piano of the same frequency will also start to vibrate. And that might happen tonight. I'm hoping that it'll happen tonight. What I hope will happen is that some of the things I say will resonate with you, and you'll think, oh, that sounds like something I've thought before. And then you and I will be in what I would call harmony. That's a good thing to be in. Oops, we don't have to be in harmony, but it's a good thing. So resonance occurs with a group of people sometimes. So this is a group of people. You might know some of these people from Northcott High School. This is my science team from last year, and you can tell, I think, by the expression on their faces that they were in harmony. They were in resonance with me. I was fired up about going to the Science Olympiad, and they were too. So we were all on the same page. And so I hope everybody looks like this when you leave at the end of the day. I love teaching, and I appreciate the chance to try it again. Now, I found a quote about democracy, and it struck me that this quote about democracy, that it's not neat, orderly, or quiet, requires a certain relish for confusion. That sort of applies to my experiences in theology as well. I always come out excited and confused when I'm discussing things about my own personal faith. And I'm on a journey to learn as much as I can. So I'm not done with that journey, and I hope I'll learn more about it. I also know that no man can give another his religion. So I'm going to tell you some things about my personal faith, and at the same time, not expect you to have exactly the same journey. But there might be some resonance. There might be some things that you've thought of before. So I have a lot of things I could tell you about myself. My wife, Deborah, is right here, for example. And it's wonderful to travel through my journey with her. But also, you should know that I have enjoyed my teaching career at North Cobb. Worked at NASA for a while. I've won a number of different kinds of awards. The most important for me to mention to you this evening is this National Evolution Award. I just wanted to, since nobody was really wanting me to tell you my life story, just wanted you to have some idea that I'm standing up here because I carry a little experience behind my life. So I've been through a lot, and I've had not an easy time sometimes trying to explain what I think about evolution and my faith. So, and I'm not done figuring all that out. But I want you to know that I'm a pretty good source person for this kind of thing. So I wanted you, since y'all don't know me very well, I wanted you to know a little bit about me. Also, I was born into a Baptist family, and at age 6, we suddenly became Lutheran. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about exactly how that happened, but it happened that there was a minister who did not think that Catholics should become presidents back in 1960, and my mother was very opposed to this notion, and we just got up and left, which was sad because I really liked the preschool type toys they had. But we started going to a Lutheran church, and when you're named McCoy and you're in a Lutheran church, it doesn't fit exactly because there aren't that many Scotch-Irish folk. There's lots of Scandinavians and Germans. I had a Sunday school teacher named Siegfried. So it's not quite the same as growing up Baptist. And because of that, I started asking a whole lot of questions. So in this Lutheran church, I became a question asker. And people always knew, oh yeah, McCoy. He's the guy who asks the questions all the time. And, he didn't really grow up Lutheran. But I was in a place where asking questions seemed pretty normal. And that is a gift. I didn't realize until I was an adult what a gift that was, that it was so easy to get away with asking so many questions in church. It was wonderful. So I got to learn a lot of things. Does anybody know what this is by any chance?
Cyrillic alphabet.
Yes, Cyrillic, so it's Russian. Very good. Here's a hint. Periodic table of the elements. This is Mendeleev's very first published periodic table of the elements, where he discovered all kinds of patterns in the universe. He discovered how hydrogen and helium and carbon and oxygen were related to one another, and they have different particular behaviors because of their structure. So he published this, and later on it turned into something more or less that looked like this. This is the more up-to-date version of the periodic table of the elements. Well, I found out about this when I was in the 6th grade. And I came running home from Powers Ferry Elementary School, and I showed it to my mom, and I said, this is the coolest thing. Look at all this stuff they found out about the elements and what they do together. And my mom started laughing, and she said, I'll bet God was just tickled to death when y'all figured that out. And that's kind of my motto about science. I mean, God is the author of all. And as a result, if we can figure out what's going on in the periodic table of the elements, we can get some idea of the order that God has placed on our universe. And it's a wonderful revelation to figure those things out. So the same is true of evolution to me. If you can figure out how evolution is working, you can kind of figure out how God set up not just creation a long time ago for a little while, but how creation is ongoing. We have a universe that can create all the time, and that's so amazing to observe. By the way, you can change the periodic table of the elements any way you want. Make up your own periodic table of the elements if you want to. I don't know why people do those things, but it's fun. These three concepts are really important to me: faith, hope, and love. You've probably read about them before. And they are, to me, as real as anything in science. I mean, I cannot measure them. There's no such thing as a hopeometer to measure the amount of hope a person has. But I know that these things are real. I know that they're real. And one way I know that they're real is not from measurement, but by what it is like to be in a room with someone who is not full of love or full of hope. or full of faith. If someone has lost their hope, you know something's very different about the way they look at the world. And you know that there perhaps is a calling for you to do something about that, to intervene in some way. That's a very painful experience, to have lost hope or to have a broken heart, to be inconsolable because of grief, to be a child and you've lied to your parents and then your parents have forgiven you. When those things happen, God is right there, right at that exact moment. You know God is sitting right there holding the hand of the person who cannot be consoled, holding the hand of the person who's lost their faith. And God won't let us go. I believe that has absolutely nothing to do with measurement by science, because that is outside scientific experience. You cannot measure things related to how God works in the world. And that's where people sometimes get confused. There are scientists, for example, who have claimed that we are only able to figure out things that we can measure. Well, I beg to differ. These are things that can't be measured, but they are as real as anything else in the world. I also believe that the word miracle is vastly underused. People want to use the word miracle to describe something which we can't explain very well. But I'm great with the fact that we can explain pretty well how hormones and enzymes work during pregnancy, and that then results in this baby being born. That's a miracle. We can explain it pretty well. We can't always predict exactly what's going to happen, but we can explain a lot of those biochemical processes really well. Very different from the way that the word miracle is sometimes used. So I think we ought to use it more often. Sometimes when people join the church, that's a miracle. Okay, so trust is a word that I use sometimes to describe the way I view faith. I was in surgery, I was thinking about going into surgery, and I was trying to choose what form of surgery and what surgeon to use. And there came a moment when I reached out my hand to a surgeon and I said, "Shake my hand, you're the one. You are the guy. You're going to do my surgery, and we're going to do it your way." I had other choices, but I chose that choice. And that's kind of how I explain how I come to faith. This is something that I do frequently. I think about this. Am I going to extend my hand today? Yep, I'm going to keep on doing it today. This is great. I'm going to keep on doing it. I don't know what the outcome's going to be. I don't know how you can. But I'm going to extend my hand anyway and put my trust into a power much greater than myself. So I wanted to include in this one of the scriptures that has been a constant companion and a puzzlement to me a bit. And Margaret Johnson has agreed to be a reader for us. But this is a parable of Jesus that you probably have heard a few times before. So Matthew 25, verse 19 through 30. Margaret, if you would read that.
After a long time, their master returned from his trip and called them to him to account for his money. The man to whom he had entrusted 5,000 brought him 10,000. His master praised him for his good work. "You have been faithful in handling a small amount," he told him. "So now I will give you many more responsibilities. Begin the joyous task I have assigned to you." Next came the man who had received 2,000 with the report, "Sir, you gave me 2,000 ewes, and I have doubled it." "Good work," his master said. "You are a good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over the small amount, so now I will give you much more." Then the man with 1,000 came and said, "Sir, I knew you were a hard man, and I was afraid you would rob me of what I earned. So I hid your money in the earth, and here it is." But his master replied, "Wicked man, lazy slave, since you knew I would demand your profit, you should have at least put my money into the bank so I could have some interest. Take the money from this man and give it to the man with the 10,000. For the man who uses well what is given shall be given more, and he shall have abundance. But from the man who is unfaithful, even what little responsibility he has shall be taken from him.
that last verse really scared me to death. I don't want wailing and gnashing of teeth. I know that. So what is this about? I don't know exactly. I kind of get the gist. I kind of get the idea. But there are many explanations for this message that comes from Jesus. And when something comes from Jesus, I want to try to pay attention to it if I can, and try to figure out what the message is. Now, God is our Father, and we are children. And I often think that if my dad had left a message on our dining room table, and then we all came home from school, there were 6 children in my family, and all 6 of us then read this message, each one of us would read the message slightly differently. And that's okay with me. Maybe I was particularly mad at my father at that time, or maybe someone else had just gotten a nice treat from Dad the day before. I don't know. So different people are going to read this in different ways. But I was, as a grade school child, I was always fascinated by this word, talent, the idea of a talent. And it's a measure of silver, of course. But the word talent now refers to a lot of other things. So it's a word that means more than one thing. And one thing that it can mean is your skill, your passion, your interest in studying something, for example. So passion for stringed musical instruments, a passion for dancing, a passion for artwork. Could be a passion for history, could be a passion for theology. For me, I was fascinated with science. All the way back to the time when I was a little 5-year-old and I saw Sputnik flying over in my front yard with my grandfather pointing it out to me as it was going over. So I knew that science was going to be something that I was going to do all my life if I could. And I think part of what this message to us is, don't do what this guy's doing, and that's hide your talent. Don't put it aside so that it'll be safe. Don't keep it away from other people. Use it and try to enrich not only yourself, not just me making myself happy because I like studying science, but me making my master happy, me making my Lord happy. Studying science then can become a way to glorify God and also, by the way, help the rest of the world. So that may be very simplistic. I'm not a theologian, but that's kind of what I got out of it when I was in Luther Ridge summer camp. And that's the sort of thing that I carry with me now to this day. This picture of this guy kneeling down and hiding the talent so that other people wouldn't get it, that resonates with me because for at least 8 or 10 years of my teaching, that's what I did with my understanding of evolution. I didn't want to rock the boat and upset administrators and students, so I would, play very, very low-key kind of messages about evolution and not get people too upset. And then I thought, that's not how you do it. What you do is you celebrate the idea that God is involved in evolution. And by the way, it's a very bad idea to preach religion in your science class. That's another story. Okay, so I believe that God loves us. God wants to share that love everywhere. God wants us to use all of our talents. And the more we know about the world, the better we understand God. Therefore, I believe that science is a Christian vocation. It's a calling that serves to glorify Christ. And if you don't believe me, then 2 weeks from now, Jim Miller will be here from the Presbyterian Association on Science, Technology, and the Christian Faith. And if he can't convince you that that's true, nobody can. So that's a very exciting program that I hope some of you will show up for. So this picture is a summary of my observations. Lots of people seem to think that you have to choose one or the other in this picture. This guy's haircut is really suspicious, by the way. So if you haven't heard, most people assume that you have to choose, do you believe in God or do you reject God and believe in science? And I run into this same idea all the time. Somebody's telling it to their children because it's all over the place. And I don't know that that's a fair comparison. Like I said, you can't measure faith and hope and love, but you can measure things in science. In fact, if you can't measure things, you can't really call them science. So it's a bit like arguing about this book, this magazine here, and saying, this magazine is made of paper. And then someone else says, no, it's not, it's rectangular. So I don't know where you go with that kind of argument. You can just yell at each other all day long. You're talking about two completely different categories, two categories that you can't compare them. So it's the same kind of thing. So these kinds of websites they're very sad to me, because I think folks are missing some of the bigger picture. By the way, I just want you to be aware that I am not the only person on the planet who thinks that God has developed this process known as evolution. I just want you to be aware. I don't want to think that I'm the only one who thinks this. Okay. So I suggest we go home by another way. Instead of saying we're going to argue about evolution or reject evolution and accept God, what we're going to do is reject the false dilemma and embrace the findings of science and spiritual truth, both at the same time. A guy named C.S. Lewis was fond of talking about a philosophical idea known as nothing buttery. I don't think he invented or coined this expression, but he was fond of pointing out the problem of claiming that something was nothing but something else. For example, is thought nothing but a series of chemical processes in neurons in your brain? If that's true, then we're just machines, and we're just sort of reacting to our environment. And in the same way, you don't want to say that evolution is nothing but a random sequence of occurrences. You want to be able to describe it really well. There was a fairly famous scientist named Richard Dawkins who wrote a book called The God Delusion. And he has been guilty, I think, of quite a few nothing buttery statements where he's talking about religion as being nothing but a social response to promote reproduction and keep a population healthy. So I don't know that that's quite enough to explain what human life is all about. So we want to try to avoid this conundrum if we can. I will not be talking about the Big Bang Theory, not because there's anything wrong with the TV show. No. The Big Bang Theory is sort of a different idea from the one that we talk about in evolution. This might be called cosmic evolution, the idea that there was a Big Bang, and from this Big Bang, the universe inflated and formed all these particles, including the Higgs boson, which was discovered about 3 years ago. At least there's evidence. We say there's evidence for a Higgs boson that gives things mass. So this is not really what I'm going to talk about tonight. It's a fun thing to talk about. I've taught astronomy before, so we can talk about that, but not for tonight. Also, we're not really talking so much about the origins of life tonight. Although, for example, if you have any questions about origins of life, I'd be glad to try to answer them. But this is a gigantic mystery. There are people who are studying the origins of life not only here on this planet, but also on other planets outside our solar system. Lots of planets have been discovered that have water and good temperatures, and there could be life on those other planets. Very exciting to think about. It's so exciting that the Gordon Research Conferences this year have chosen as their main topic the origin of life, to try to figure out what are you guys out in the science world figuring out about the origin of life. How does DNA get here? How do you get proteins forming in cells? And all that kind of thing. So people are studying this, but make no mistake, this is a big mystery. And there's nothing that gets scientists excited like a big mystery. You don't just sit down and say, oh, well, it's a big mystery. Too bad. No, that's when they start applying for grant funding. This is stuff we need to find out about. Okay. So we need to go over some basic science. If you want to take notes, welcome to. Remember, Riley's going to be great in the quiz. So, hypothesis is a testable prediction. So you make a prediction about something and you test it. That's not the same thing as a theory. Theory is coming next. Scientists don't like to say things are true. If you don't believe me, ask a lawyer who is called a scientist as a witness in court. Because scientists will say things, well, we have a 95% probability, and that's not what the lawyer wants. They want certainty. And scientists prefer to say that a hypothesis is supported by evidence, That's where science likes to sit on this idea of supporting things by evidence. We typically do experiments. This is an example of a typical experiment that students might do in a classroom and go to science fair and so forth. Some of my students have done such things before. That is one way of doing experiments. There are ways of doing experiments that don't involve display boards. So this is not the only way to do experiments. But that's what a lot of people do. They set up a hypothesis, a guess, a prediction about things, and then they test the idea to see if it's got evidence to support it. Now, the word theory is quite different from that. A theory is an explanation. Theory is an explanation. It's a way of explaining natural phenomena, and it's based on a large amount of evidence. So theories are well substantiated, and they can make predictions. If you have a theory, like gravity, for example, you can typically make a prediction about what's going to happen. If you drop the gallon of milk off the countertop, it's going to fall. The theory can then be modified by accumulating new evidence. So you can have falsified theories. If you drop a gallon of milk and it goes up to the ceiling, something else is happening there that's not exactly gravity. Also, you want to try to find out if the theory is valuable. Can it point us to new discoveries? Is the theory used as a framework to explain new discoveries? Read the scientific journals and see if scientists are talking about how useful this theory is in their deliberations, in their exploration of the world. That's how you know whether a theory is really worthwhile. So, evolution or gravity, which one is a theory? Which one of those is a theory? Theory of evolution, theory of gravity. Remember that a theory is an explanation of natural phenomena based on a large amount of evidence. So, let me tell you about a parent conference I had one time. So there's this, wasn't Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, don't worry, Brad. We had this, a parent came in who objected to my teaching of evolution in the classroom. And said, here's what I do and here's why I do it. And the parent said, well, I can understand why you might teach gravity, because gravity is real. But evolution, that's just a theory. That's not really real. It's just like something that people made up. And I happen to have this magazine with me. It just so happened. I'm never getting rid of this magazine because it says, Discover Magazine, Gravity, the most mysterious force in the universe. We don't know how it works. We don't know all there is to know about gravity. So there's some mystery there. And that's where scientists say, oh yeah, let's go find out what's going on. So gravity, though, the theory of gravity can explain a lot of things about how the universe works. So we use it a lot to explain how the universe works. Same thing's true of gravity.
Of evolution.
Yes, theory of evolution. Thank you so much. I'm always glad to bring my wife to my presentation. Can a theory become a fact? So let's try to figure that one out. This is a question I get frequently. A fact refers to observation, a measurement, some form of evidence that can be expected to occur the same way all the time under similar circumstances. That's what the National Academy of Sciences says. I'm not saying you have to accept their authority. They're pretty smart. So I'm going with their definition. So example of a fact. 3 o'clock today, it's 81 degrees Fahrenheit. Fact. Measured at 81 degrees. Okay, but that doesn't explain why it was 81 degrees. Fact doesn't tell you why, but the theory does. Convection theory. The sun heats the earth warms up, it warms up the air above the soil, the air then rises, that creates wind, that causes things to start moving around, rotation of the earth causes wind patterns to move in certain directions. Now we're starting to get some explanations of why it's 81 degrees Fahrenheit outside. So theories can help you explain why facts are there, but they're not able to become a fact. But as far as the way we usually use the term fact, it doesn't make any sense. So here's a sort of activity that I do. I shortened it down for our audience today. Something that I do with my students. I put some pictures or some words up on the screen, and I ask for them to give me thumbs up if they agree or thumbs down if they disagree. You remember doing this? So agree or disagree, do you agree with this sentence? Birds eating rice thrown at weddings swell up and die, even burst. Okay. Normally what I would do is I would count how many, and I'm not going to do that. I don't have time. Okay, so giving chocolate to dogs causes toxic poison reactions. Okay. And when cows fall asleep standing up, it is easy and fun to sneak up next to them and tip them over. See, the confusing part is I wrote and fun. So that throws a little twist into the statement. How about this? The President of the United States has the power to stop construction of new roads in a national forest. Not so many people willing to guess on it. And stopping the construction of roads in a forest slows down the extinction of species. Okay? And one more. There's really no argument. She's a sweet lady, but come on. Okay, so these sentences, after we get through going over, I usually give about 12 of them. And after we go through them, then I say, okay, we all voted. That's not how you do science. You don't say, okay, how many people think that tree out there is doing photosynthesis? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yay, the tree must be doing photosynthesis. That's not how it works. What you do is you gather evidence, and you look at the evidence, and you see where the evidence points. Does the evidence then tell you whether the tree is doing photosynthesis? These are things that you can do experiments about. These 3 sentences, you can actually imagine someone doing an experiment about it. Some of them are not very nice experiments. Like, I would think I could just jam some rice down a bird's throat and see if he blows up. That wouldn't be very nice. Another way of doing that would be to go to a lot of weddings and then hang out afterwards. Especially weddings where they threw rice. This is actually an urban legend. Churches stopped using rice at weddings in many cases because people were slipping on the uncooked rice on hard floors, and they said, let's use birdseed or bubbles or something like that instead. But that's kind of funny. Giving chocolate to dogs, we could do a horrible set of experiments, feeding M&Ms to dogs until we see a reaction. But actually, that's probably better done by examining the records of veterinarians to find out what have they found out in people who have brought their dogs to the clinic. It can cause very bad things to happen in a dog. This, by the way, I just want to stand up and be a witness as someone who has experienced this. It's impossible to sneak up on a cow. They're not asleep. They're not. They might look like it, but they're not asleep. So I just want you to know that is absolutely untrue. I have the evidence to support that hypothesis. Now, these statements are not really things you can test with science, except for one. One of them you can test with science. Which one? The second. Stopping the construction of roads can slow down the extinction of species. We could do that in a very unethical way. We could go out and just start cutting roads all over the place to see if species go extinct. A better way might be to compare places where roads were cut to places where roads were not cut, to see if we can get an answer that way. This is a legal question. Probably the Constitution, the U.S. Code, that's where you look for an answer to a legal question. You can't test that with science. It doesn't mean it's not important. Just because you can't test it with science, it means it's in a different category of thinking. Same thing with this. John Lennon wrote better music than Taylor Swift. I don't even know how to judge music. I know what I like and I know what I don't like, but I don't know what's good and what's really bad. So I'll probably know what's really bad. Okay, so science can't do everything. The sentences on the left, science really can't answer these questions for you, especially what should I do with my life? What's the point of my life? What's the point of existence? Science is pretty silent on that issue. What we have to do then is formulate other ways of getting information. We can, for example, we can use music and poetry, which can say things that ordinary language can't say. We can use prayer. We can communicate to each other by setting up societies that have certain rules we call laws Those are all ways that we can investigate the world and try things out and see what works and see what doesn't work so that we can understand our life a little bit better. But science can't do everything. So when people tell you that, don't listen to them. They don't know what they're talking about. Okay, I need you to remember that living things are made of cells. That's going to be an important thing to talk about. Cell parts are often made of protein. I'm oversimplifying here. Also, enzymes are proteins, and enzymes control a lot of our chemical reactions, which then cause us to make things like lipids and carbohydrates, for example. Okay, so just remember there's some chemical things happening in our cells. You know, also there's a chemical called DNA in our cells which controls these processes. It has the information that tells us how to make protein, how to make enzymes, which then in turn control chemical processes in our cells. You might also know that DNA stays in the cell nucleus. There's a messenger molecule marked in the color red right here. This messenger molecule can leave the nucleus and it can go out to a protein factory called a ribosome. And that's where we manufacture the proteins that then make our cells. So if we understand that, then we can read the DNA message. And we know what the DNA message means. We can tell which protein is being made. This is an example of what a ribosome might look like. We're assembling amino acids to form proteins. Okay, don't worry. Wow, these great inquiries. So, quick view. What is evolution? In simplest forms that I can write, DNA, your genes are your plan for your body, and they hold information. The process of reproduction requires copying this DNA. You can't just have a baby with no information. You have to give information to the baby. So you give DNA to the baby. Copying errors do occur, sometimes with tragic results. You probably are familiar with some of those. But usually, here's the great thing, usually the copying works great. But occasionally there are errors. These are called variations or mutations. And the errors can be passed on to the future generation. Also, some errors are very bad. For example, if a woodpecker was born with a brittle skull, that woodpecker is not going to last very long. So the babies would not be produced at a very high rate. Some errors, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. All of us have mutations called neutral mutations, a change in our DNA which cause no change at all in your body. And then there are some mutations that are quite good. They're advantageous mutations, like a human being born with the ability to carry more oxygen in their blood than your normal, ordinary person. That would be an awesome mutation to have. So if you have that mutation, you could perhaps run longer and faster than other folks. So long legs on gazelles. The gazelle can outrun predators a little bit better and live longer. Okay. The population of organisms will be considerably different if the ones that survive then reproduce and then have more babies. That's what we're looking at as a quick view of evolution. Mutations are things hitting your DNA. They could be caused by ultraviolet light, for example, or by chemicals in the environment, or enzyme interference. The process we're talking about is natural selection, where some organisms survive and do well, others do not. The ones that don't survive well don't get to reproduce. That's one of the rules. And sometimes new species can form. We can see new species forming now. And if two groups of organisms are somehow isolated from each other, then there might be species formation. But evolution can occur without the formation of a new species. Okay. If there are two species forming, then they're not likely to have the same mutations in two different groups. So if you bring the two groups together, they probably would not be able to mate. We can see examples of that in the world today. So what is the word species? This is an important word. Species is a group of living things that are similar, they can breed together, and they produce fertile offspring. That's a species. So a horse and a donkey can breed together, but their offspring, the mule, is not fertile, so we say the horse and the donkey are two different species. Also, the word population is an important word. Population is a group of living things that belong to the same species. They live in the same area, and then they can reproduce together. So you can have a population of humans in Atlanta. You can have a population of pine trees at Kennesaw Mountain. You can have a population of bacteria in the back of your throat. There's all kinds of populations that we could study. So gene pool is a word that I don't have to use tonight, but I thought I would throw it out there at you. Gene pool is the collection of genes in the population. So if we have horses that live in Texas, we can say that it's possible that the gene pool in Texas is a little different from the gene pool in Connecticut. We could say the horses in Connecticut don't have exactly the same DNA as the horses in Texas. It just depends on how many white horses and how many of the Clydesdales you have and so forth. There might be differences. These are two folks who kind of came up with these ideas that I'm espousing for you today, Hardy and Weinberg, back in 1908. Godfrey Hardy was a mathematician who noticed some patterns and wrote about these patterns. And Weinberg was a physician who noticed some of the same patterns and wrote about them. They didn't really work together, but they came up with the same ideas at just about exactly the same times. And the way they wrote about them is by publishing, especially publishing some of their letters to various academic journals. They came up with the idea of allele frequency or gene frequency. How common is a certain gene in a population? So they measured the percentages of dominant genes and recessive genes in populations. And they wanted to see if those would change over a period of time. They chose to use what we might call percentages to measure those things. So, for example, you might say that a lizard population had 64% of the lizards that had two dominant genes, big F, and then maybe 32% of the lizards were big F, little f, and only 4% had two recessive genes, little f, little f. And that means they might look different, or they might act different, or they might have a different way of digesting their food. Something might be different about them because of those genes they had that were different. So they made up this other idea. Hardy and Weinberg said, well, what is genetic equilibrium? That's the word we're going to use to mean a population that stays the same all the time. It's always staying the same. Population doesn't change its percentages. It just keeps the same percentages all the time. Animals are born, animals die, but the percentages seem to stay the same all the time. And when they examined the natural world and looked around at lizards and cows and horses and chickens and people, they didn't see that. They didn't see populations staying the same all the time. They saw change in populations all over the place. So people started looking at this idea, measuring genetic equilibrium, using these fancy algebra formulas that tell you how things can change over time. And they were wondering, hey, if this population is changing, if the population is not staying the same, what could be the reason? What could be an explanation for changing the population? And that's one of the first things they came up with. Well, there might be some horses from Texas moving to Connecticut. That could explain it. Maybe there are migrations going on. Well, that's what Hardy and Weinberg called gene flow. Genes are moving from one place to another in the gene pool. Could be mutations. Something's hitting the DNA, causing it to change a little bit. That could explain it. Could be that there's mate selection going on. Maybe the Clydesdales are only marrying other Clydesdales. Could be. That's what's going on. Those Scottish horses. So it could be that there's mate selection, and that could determine how successful they are. If they're not being selected as a mate, not going to be able to reproduce. That could be that there are predators. Maybe there's a predator eating some of these lizards or horses, but not others. Maybe there's a disease killing some of the lizards, but not others. Maybe there's a famine or a drought. That's what they call natural selection. They are the only ones to use that term. And then maybe there's just an accident. Maybe the most amazing Clydesdale horse in the world that all the female Clydesdales really wanted to marry. He was hit and killed one day by a car or a wagon or a fire truck, and he's gone. That was an accident. It had nothing to do with how awesome he was. He's just gone. So those accidents they call genetic drift, sort of a random kind of event that might explain it. So there's some randomness in this, but not a lot. Not a lot of randomness. Some of those things are like migration. Animals move in a very decided way when they decide to migrate. So Hardy and Weinberg came up with this list, which is an amazing list of exactly how evolution occurs. These are the various things that cause evolution to occur. As a matter of fact, if we observe variation, this is what we'll see. We'll see that variation exists, and that some of the variations cause good things to happen or helpful. Some things cause bad things to happen. They might decrease your lifespan. Variations in plants, for example, can occur. You can see variations in these different leaves in these anthurium plants. They're all the same species, but they vary from one another. If you don't deal with anthurium plants on a daily basis, you might not notice it, but you probably can tell that there are some variations there. Same thing with these snails. Variations can occur in snails, in any animal, and these snails are not all the same. They're the same species, but they don't all look alike. They have different genes. Maybe there's a 40% appearance of the gene for yellow color, for example. Observing variation can also mean that it's possible for a population of snails, for example, to become physically separated. They might be separated from each other. It's possible that mutations can occur. Meiosis, the formation of egg and sperm cells to then form babies. That can cause variations to appear. And some offspring will survive better than others. All that can be related to physical barriers, for example. There might be barriers that prevent animals from crossing rivers or roads or mountain ranges or oceans. New variations can appear in a population. And if they are successful at reproducing, you might see this all over the place. This is a little scarier mutation. This is a sunflower that has perhaps, it would not be the number one market choice at the florist shop. People wouldn't take it home. But look at all the seeds. This guy is going to make a lot of babies. So this is perhaps a successful mutation in that he's making a lot of seeds which can then go and produce babies. Or it may be that a florist sees this and it scares them to death and they chop it up and burn it and they don't ever want to plant it. So that is a human interference, which is sometimes called artificial selection. Variations can occur in our best friend and our dogs, and they might reproduce, they might not, I don't know. They have to be chosen. When you observe variation, you know that offspring that survive in one area perhaps will not survive in another. Variations in two groups could accumulate over time, and then different variations occur in the two separated groups. You wouldn't expect squirrels on one side of the Grand Canyon to have exactly the same mutations as those on another side of the Grand Canyon, for example. So individuals that die out don't get to reproduce. And in some cases, if the two groups become so different from each other that they can't reproduce together at all, then we say there's a new species. But you can have evolution that is change in the population without having any species forming at all. This process is called evolution, and it's a set of natural processes that causes change in the population of living things over time. Now, occasionally, I will fly on an airplane without my wife. And when I do that, I have this little seat by myself, and there's somebody usually next to me. And the conversation, sometimes they talk, sometimes they don't. If they talk to me and say, "So what do you do for a living?" I have started telling people I'm an evolution teacher. Because then you get some really cool discussions going on. And we hope it's not a 7-hour flight, that sometimes you kind of run out of things to say. So this is the definition that I use for evolution. And usually they'll say, evolution. And I ask them, well, what is your definition? And they hardly ever say this. That's hardly ever what people say evolution is. Usually they say, well, that's where one animal turns into another. Same thing. So scientists study natural processes and they look for natural explanations. That's what we try to do. And I'm going to show you as much as I can about evolution. But this is what I tell my students too. But I want you to know that it's the foundation of all biology. But scientists cannot explain philosophical and religious questions very well. Now, an individual scientist might be a very religious person, but science processes and experiments aren't going to get you very far in examining God. How big is God? How many kiloliters is God's volume? You can't do that. So it's not going to help you. However, it could inspire you, as it has inspired me. Probably the best easy explanation of how evolution works to affect our lives is the evolution of antibiotic tolerance and resistance in bacteria. When I ask students about this, the most common answer that I get as far as how does this happen, they think this. They think that, okay, so there's some bacteria on your hand. You put antibiotic on your hand. The bacteria go, oh no, antibiotic! And they change themselves so that they are now suddenly immune to antibiotic. Now I'm not going to die because now I'm immune. And that can't happen. I'm born as a certain person. I'm not going to be able to change over into another kind of living thing. The thing that confuses the students is our immune system. They're thinking about the organism, the bacteria, having an immune system. It doesn't quite work that way. It'd be more like this. Imagine that I was on a big ship like the Titanic, and there was this woman who said, don't worry, Jack, I'll be right here, and you are falling off into the water. That would be a perfect time for you to suddenly pop gills out of the side of your neck and start swimming around. But it's unfortunate. You won't be able to do that. You're stuck with the body that you have. Same thing with the bacteria. They're stuck with the body that they're born with. So the bacteria is born with the body. Along comes the antibiotic. It either kills them or it doesn't. What if it doesn't? What if it doesn't kill a few of those bacteria? Those guys are going to reproduce. And they're going to have babies who also are not killed by the bacteria. After a while, you might have a whole lot of those guys. They're going to be a problem for you. So this is an example of how that might work in real life. There's one resistant bacterium that happened to be born with a particular kind of protein in their cell membrane that said, no, not going to allow this antibiotic to hurt me. And 100 years later, antibiotics are invented. And these bacteria that are resistant don't die because of the antibiotic. Most of the normal bacteria do die. And then the resistant bacteria multiply. A lot of orange things are growing there. Especially if you stop taking your antibiotics, then you wind up with a new strain of bacteria, a new population. None of these bacteria were alive back here. These are the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of these guys. We noticed it in our bodies because bacteria have babies about every 20 minutes. So we can see great-great-grandchildren in about a day and a half fairly easily. So that's one thing we mean by evolution. Evolution by natural selection. Variation exists. Evolution says that our variation comes from mutations, meiosis. Natural selection occurs. Some animals live, some animals die, and the ones that live are the ones that have the babies. And the result is allele frequency changes. Our population changes. So the population changes, but not the individual organisms. Now, the first book on evolution that I've been able to find out about was written by a guy named Aristotle. So that book was written a long time ago, and it mentions the idea of animals being related, like camels, different kinds of camels being related to one another. But he's not the only person who wrote a book. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck wrote a book in which he described in the 1700s how giraffes got long necks, for example. And his idea was that the animals stretched their necks to reach up and get food from high branches of trees, and then were able to pass on this acquired characteristic to their children. Now, typically when I'm on the airplane and I'm asking a person, tell me how evolution works, that's usually kind of how they think it works, that an animal is stretching their neck and that's causing the change in the body, which then can be passed on to the baby. If that was true, I would be able to play the piano and sing really, really well because my mom could, but I didn't take piano lessons, so I don't have that ability. So you can't inherit tattoos, something that you acquire after your birth. It would save a lot of money for a lot of folks. If your dad got tattooed and you were born with those same tattoos, it'd really help, but it can't happen. So even though it kind of makes sense, this idea does not have any currency. Now there are people who talk about Lamarckian evolution today, and it's worth discussing exactly how it works. Animals face a need to change, as all of us do. Then they make themselves change, as all of us try to do. And then, here's the part that really can't happen. They pass on the change to their children. That's the part that can't really happen. And the problem really, Lamarck was a smart guy, but he did not know anything about genetics. That was the problem. He didn't know how genetics worked. And by the way, neither did this guy. Charles Darwin, probably have heard of him before. He didn't know how genetics worked. In fact, in the 1850s, people thought genetics was in the blood. That's why we're still referred to sometimes as blood relatives, because people thought that's kind of how you somehow passed your characteristics to your children. Charles Darwin, at a fairly young age, set out on a 5-year voyage after having graduated from college to be a minister. He was going to be a vicar at a local church, and went on this voyage because he was really passionate about insects and birds and snails and things. And he observed all kinds of animals all over the world. He collected massive notes, and he wrote books, which he then did not publish for a long, long time. This is one of my favorite diagrams that he drew one day. He was trying to figure out how these different animals might have arisen. And he was talking about, in this diagram, talking about a group, which we now call a population, that somehow had death and then new birth, and the new birth looked a little different from the old guys, and therefore the populations changed in all these different environments. And that's very similar to a structure we call a cladogram. If Darwin is a genius about anything, this is what he's a genius about. His vicar training for working in a church included things like keeping records of baptisms and marriages and funerals and so forth. So he knew how to do these kinds of diagrams. This is a diagram of females in a population. A great-grandmother, 2 grandmothers, 3 mothers, and 1, 2, 3, 4 daughters there. Here are 2 children called Heidi and Arlene, and they are very obviously closely related to each other because they have the same mother. Okay. However, Megan and Celia are related to Heidi and Arlene because they have the same great-grandmother. They have the same common ancestor. So that is not changing great-grandmother into Arlene. Great-grandmother did not turn into Arlene, but great-grandmother gave birth to a lot of folks, and those folks gave birth to other folks, which gave birth to other folks, and these folks, you can tell who's more closely related. Well, here's the thing that's such a genius thing that Darwin did. He took the same diagram and made it into groups. Instead of great-grandmother, you've got a group, a population. And the population gave rise to other populations, which did not look exactly alike. They were somewhat different from each other. Some of them didn't survive. That's called extinction right there, where this one did not produce any offspring. But these guys did. And maybe these guys are around now, and these guys aren't anymore. So that's what Darwin was talking about in common ancestors of populations. Of course, it took him about 20 years before he published this because he was afraid about what the public opinion might be, especially related to religious views of evolution and his ideas of natural selection. He didn't know about these guys. The North Rim and the Grand Canyon has different environment from the South Rim, so therefore you have 2 different kinds of squirrels which cannot interbreed with each other, so we call them 2 different species. These are not 2 different species. These are chameleons. This one can change color. This one can change color, depending on their background. They have that ability to not look the same in various environments. That's an ability that they inherited from their parents. So again, how can evolution occur? And how can the allele frequency in a population change? You notice that that's the same list. So evolution really means changing allele frequency, changing a population. That's really what it means. We can make a lot of predictions, and I can go over as many of these as you want, or I can just go over a couple of them. I think I want to make sure I leave room for a lot of questions as well if you have questions. But predictions can be made based on biogeography. That should show species patterns and we can understand. If evolution is really happening, we should see homologous structures. That means structures that look the same in similar species. We should look at if evolution is really true, we should see homologous DNA. So the DNA of a horse might be very similar to the DNA of a zebra. We would expect that to be true. There should be evolution going on right now. We should be able to spot that. We should see fossils that show something's living now that have not always been here. All of these things should be predictable based on what we think about evolution. Biogeography should show us some things. For example, we find this plant, a fern, living on South America. We find these fossils in South America, Africa, Madagascar, India, Antarctica, and Australia, indicating that some things have changed from the past. Things are not the same now as they were a long time ago. We can piece together a bit of the history of the world based on some of these fossils that we have found. We should also be able to see homologous or vestigial structures. Homologous means similar structures. So, for example, let's look at the seal and the dolphin, for example. The dolphin has upper arm bone called humerus, the radius and the ulna, carpals, metacarpals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 phalanges, and so does the seal. The DNA that tells them to build arm bones is very similar in the dolphin and in the seal. So we say that they are related to each other because of that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 phalanges, metacarpals, carpals. There's the radius and the ulna. There's the humerus. So those are called homologous skeletal structures. These we call homologous ovipositors. This is an insect that has a stinger. There is a tube called an ovipositor that a female insect has, a hollow tube for laying eggs. That has been modified by genetic changes. We call those mutations. And some proteins in this area are very irritating. So they can use that tube to sting other living things. So only the females, the female wasps and female ants and female bees, only the females have this stinger because of the fact that they're evolved from ovipositors, for example. That's a kind of prediction that we can make using evolution. We can make predictions about DNA. For example, we could say that if these organisms are really close, they're related to each other, their DNA should be very similar. And we can see by comparing the DNA of various organisms that the red panda, this guy right here, is not really very closely related to this panda right here. Here's the giant panda. But the red panda is much more closely related to a raccoon. And you can provide evidence for that hypothesis by looking at the DNA. This is DNA of cranes. These are crane species that exist now. And these forks indicate who's related to who. The black-crowned crane and the gray-crowned crane are very similar to each other in their DNA, their proteins, their behavior. They are probably relatives. They're probably relatives. They have the same DNA. Evolution of turtles includes a lot of massive fossil evidence. Turtles fossilize really well because of their thick bones and their shells. So we can tell information about the types of turtles that live now as well as turtles that lived in the past. Go to the Jekyll Island Turtle Center and find out about that. We should be able to see evolution occurring right now. Here it is. Evolution occurring right now. There's a lot of moths in Hawaii that do not mate with one another. They are reproductively isolated from each other. They're all separate species, but obviously very, very similar to one another. These heliconis butterflies, which you can find if you go to the Day Butterfly Center out at Callaway Gardens, they mutated from other nearby species just with the change of one gene. One gene change here causes them to not be able to mate with these guys here. So they have changes caused by perhaps ultraviolet light, perhaps by a chemical in the environment that then causes them to not be able to mate with nearby species. This is a wasp, Mansonia. It's alive right now, and you can see that it is able to produce a chemical, a cytoplasmic chemical, that blocks the sperm cells from certain males but not from other males. And that allows them to mate with one population of males but not another. Also, plants can reproduce. And when they reproduce, there might be mutations that cause some of them to not be able to mate with the others. So, for example, these do not mate with the relatives of their parents. So this parent group cannot mate with this offspring group right here because of one mutation that occurred. This is a fly that was originally on the hawthorn plant. Now you can find some flies just like it on apple trees. Apple trees were brought over a little more than 200 years ago to the United States. And the flies started hopping over to apple trees sometimes. The ones that are on the apple trees would mate only with other flies that were also on the apple tree. So they sort of separated themselves into two populations and formed new species that way. Sometimes people call this, I've met people who call this microevolution. And they say, well, that's, just changing from one kind of fly to another kind of fly. It's not really a big deal. How about a fly changing into a cat? Now, that would be really something. That's, first of all, it's not possible. But second of all, what they're talking about is what we call macroevolution. And that's a population changing and forming a group that we might call a new genus, or maybe even a member of a new family. Well, those words, genus, family, kingdom, those words are human words that we give to groups, and we kind of make our own definitions of what they mean. Go to a taxonomy conference where they're talking about the classification of flies and things, and they're arguing like crazy about even what the definition of a genus means. So it's difficult to know how many DNA mutations it would take to form a new genus all of a sudden. So most scientists would say that this kind of evolution that we're seeing now is this kind of evolution that's been happening all along and is still happening and will continue to happen in the future to form new species. This is a monarch flycatcher. It has a new melanic form, this dark form right here, and the dark form doesn't breed with the other forms. So therefore we have a new species formation in the flycatcher group. I didn't know if you wanted to read the bibliography of where I got those evolution occurring now examples, but I have them, if that is of interest to you. Also, there should be some predictions made about fossils. There's fossils that are found in amber, fossils found in rock. These bats, for example, have not always been on the earth. We can find very old fossils, fossil rocks, that don't contain any bat fossils at all. Only younger rocks will contain the bat fossils. But we can find very old rocks that do contain these crazy-looking trilobite fossils, but newer rocks don't have any of them. They went extinct a long time ago. So more evidence that things have changed quite a bit over a period of time, a long period of time. Many fossils are super common, like these foraminifera fossils. So they're actually used to help figure out how old various types of rocks are. If you see, they're called index fossils. Fossils typically form in layers of sedimentary rock, which is why Cobb County is a terrible place to look for fossils, because we have so much what we call metamorphic rock around here. And igneous, granite is igneous rock. Metamorphic rock like gneiss that you see along I-75, that's melted. So if there were any fossils in that rock, it's been melted a long time ago. But go up to the Waffle House, not far from the interstate in Chattanooga, and park and have a waffle if you want. But go up the hill, and there'll be just fossils all over the place because it's a place where you have sedimentary rock. So those are examples of index fossils. Different kinds of fossils that help us determine the age of the earth, the age of different kinds of animals and plants. This was announced on September the 5th. A brand new dinosaur was discovered. This is a dinosaur that became extinct a long time ago, but it's gigantic. It's as big, this thing called Dreadnoughtus is as big as a Boeing 737 aircraft. So it's a gigantic sort of animal that, when Margaret called me and said, hey, will you do a talk to our church? Sure. Nobody knew. I didn't know about this. They probably knew about it, but it hadn't been published yet. So I didn't know about this fossil discovery. And then there's a spiny dinosaur that was announced, discovered this week. So we would say that these are called transitional fossils, fossils that are in a pathway leading to other kinds of species. I don't like this diagram exactly because it shows, it implies that things are getting higher and higher, or perhaps better and better. That's not really what it's implying. It's more like just a timeline. So think of a timeline. These two fossils, we would predict, are found in older rocks, and these fossils were found in newer rocks. So you make a prediction, where would the transitional fossil be? It would be in medium-age rocks in between these two. And sure enough, if you go up to Greenland and look in those rocks that are that particular age, boom, you find this tiktaalik fish that seems to have legs. So you can find transitional fossils in layers of rock where you might predict that they would be. You have to go looking for them, of course, and that's really hard to do. If you go to the Kentucky Horse Museum, Kentucky Horse Park, near Lexington, Kentucky, you will find a set of skeletons that beautifully illustrate the evolution of horses in North America over a period of years. That's another set of examples of transitional fossils. And then these guys, the evolution of whales, again, it doesn't mean that this animal is better than the animals below it. It's just sort of a timeline that shows a series of different species that gave rise to the modern whales that we see today. Here's whales that have legs that walk around. And if you look at a whale now, they still have their leg bones. They still have the front leg bones, and they still have some of their hip and some of their femur in their body as well. I thought this sort of 6:15 is where I would stop and see if you have questions, and then I can also show more slides about this because I want to make sure that you have a chance to say things or ask things about this if you would like to. You're not required to. Do you? Anybody have a question at this point? Hello.
Okay, not to be different, or I understood what you said, but all right, from the whale with the leg, how did they get it into the one without the leg?
This one right here, for example, these guys have legs. If you look at the fossils of all these creatures, all of them actually have legs. They all have legs. They have femur, in this case the front leg is the humerus, then they would have the radius and the ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, and then 5 fingers. They are buried, though, in a sort of a paddle. So imagine a situation that's not that different from us. Imagine that you look at hundreds of thousands of babies that are born all over the United States. Every once in a while, a baby is born with fused fingers, fused toes. And that's not that difficult to explain. There are several different ways that could happen. It's fairly easy to fix that. You know, if you know a surgeon and you have health insurance, you can go get the limbs, the little fingers separated, and they'll work just fine. But imagine a situation where these guys don't have health insurance and they can't go to the surgeon and they wind up just sort of paddling around. Okay, some of them would die. They can't maybe move around on land. But some of them might survive better. And even a 1% increase in their ability to reproduce would eventually cause that population to change significantly over a period of time. So that seems to be what has happened in this case. There are other changes that had to occur too. So some of these that had their fused hands also had mutations in their nostrils. So their nostrils were up higher on their skull. And then some of those guys had great-great-grandchildren who had mutations where the fossils showed nose or nostrils here. And that eventually became what we call a blowhole. So they can breathe from the top of their head. Now, if they didn't survive, then they wouldn't reproduce, and we wouldn't know those great-great-grandchildren wouldn't be here today. So we can only see in the species that are around now the ones that are the survivors of the survivors. Oh yeah. Hey.
Maybe this even argues towards what I believe, which is, God-directed evolution. But what would possibly be the odds that random two randomly generated mutations, both the blowhole and the modified limbs, could occur in the same population over the same time period to allow us to go from what was obviously a well-adapted animal to land to a well-adapted animal to water. I mean, that's a pretty big leap.
Yeah, some people make the argument that God must have directed this. A scientist wouldn't be able to make that step. A scientist wouldn't be able to stand in front of the National Academy of Sciences and say, well, as you know, God made this happen, so let's go to lunch early. So they would try to explain exactly how this happened. And one thing to realize is that probably the movement from fingers to paddle didn't happen exactly at the same time as the changes in the nostril. Probably it was separated in time somewhat. But another thing to think about is how the calculations of randomness are done. So, for example, there are some scientists who are affiliated with organizations that are creationist in mindset. And they would say the randomness is so vast that you wouldn't ever be able to create anything like this just from random events, one after another. And oftentimes, a lot of those studies have been refuted by the fact that some things are possible and some things are not possible. So some events can happen and some simply cannot happen. If you go to look at the origin of proteins, for example, the origin of simple chemicals, there are certain chemicals that can form certain ways and then they can't form other ways. So if you say, let's just take water as an example. Water is a very simple molecule. It has one oxygen and it has a hydrogen on one side and a hydrogen on the other side. And because of the structure of the atoms, that's the only way water can form. Now, randomness, you would think, would indicate that 2/3 of the water molecules would have either hydrogen over here, oxygen on the side, or 2 hydrogens over here and water on this side. And that would leave only 1/3 of all water molecules with the oxygen in the middle and hydrogen on either side. So what really happens in the real world is 100% of water molecules have oxygen in the center and hydrogen on either side. So the arguments about randomness are a little bit off in their calculations because of the fact that there are certain rules about ways that things can work. There are certain processes that can happen on the earth and certain things that just don't happen. For example, none of these creatures have wheels. Not one of them has wheels. A wheel is a very complex organ, and there's no starting material to speak of for wheels. A wheel would be, let's just say, extremely unlikely, given the way proteins build, given the way that they are shaped. Plus, a wheel would have to kind of be round from the very, very start. It couldn't be a flat wheel and help you out in many ways. So, I agree that it's difficult to know all that's possible. So, while we're studying this, to try to figure out why does this guy have a blowhole that's on the front of his head, while this guy has a blowhole that's way up on the top of his head. That's a great question to try to answer. Anything else you want to ask?
It sounds like in your discussions, whether it be students or the person on the plane next to you, instead of the typical argument of going from apes to humans, you start at this very basic level.
Sure.
How do you deal with people who just truly believe, as one of the people running for Senate, the earth is only 6,000 years old? How do you even deal with discussing something like this with them?
Well, one answer is it depends on how good their cherry pie is. If they can make a really good cherry pie, I'm not going to mess with their emotions. I want them to be happy with me. But if they can't make much of a cherry pie, I'll just, no, you can't be right. It's possible that that you can meet people who, there's a gentleman named Ken Ham, for example, who has he's changed from being a very, I would use the word dishonest creationist to now being a very honest creationist. And now what he says is, I start with the Word of God. And from that point, I then proceed with any of my science. If it doesn't match the Word of God that I started with, then I reject the science. He sometimes says science hasn't caught up with the Bible. So I would argue that we need to look at the evidence and see if the evidence is reliable. And then perhaps what we need to do is rethink not the Bible, but our interpretation and understanding of what the message is in the Bible. That might be a better way of looking at it. As I said earlier, we're all children, and if Dad writes a message to us and we're trying to read the message, we're not all going to read it the same way. And I haven't ever talked to Ken Ham directly, but I've talked to people who do work with Ken Ham, and they say that there is one way to interpret the Scripture. And that just doesn't seem possible to me. It just seems, it's like saying there's only one way to interpret a tragedy of Shakespeare. There's only one way to interpret a life experience, like losing your parents. That just doesn't strike me as being possible. With the diversity of human beings on the earth, there's probably a lot of ways to understand the message from God and be right. So it seems that that's where Ken Ham and I diverge a lot. And plus the fact that a lot of science really does disagree with his biblical worldview. So he's trying to make his science look as if it's really scientific. One thing to look for is, let's see, did I put my pictures of my people? Yeah, here we are. There's our people. Evolution is used to solve a lot of problems in science, for example, in medicine. So Carlos Marino, who worked with my doctor, who did my surgery at Emory, worked with the Emory Winship Cancer Institute. He uses evolution to identify protein targets in chemotherapy. And he told me that without evolution, they would be just shooting darts in the dark, knowing what is the right kind of chemotherapy to try on this protein. He said evolution shows them patterns among all the species, and even within the human population. You can see protein patterns that then can be used to help you figure out what should be a good protein chemotherapy for you that might be slightly different from the chemotherapy for me. Francisca Michor is at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and she actually takes DNA fingerprints from people and figures out why some people are more susceptible to a disease than another. And why does that run in families? Well, why do things run in families? Aren't populations changing over a period of time? Aren't some people dying and other people reproducing successfully? So both of these people are saying we have to use evolution in order to do our work that we're doing. I think I have. Yeah, Francis Collins, who is a director now of the National Institutes of Health, he uses evolution to identify DNA and amino acid sequence similarity, pointing to common ancestors. The Human Genome Project website, by the way, has lots of DNA samples from all over the world, from all different species, and you can compare them yourself. I do this with my night craters, right? Right, night craters? I do this with my night craters. So you can actually compare one species to another and see where the DNA is alike and where it's different. That's sort of evidence that these creatures are related to each other by common ancestry. In fact, Francis Collins points to one origin of life, that all life on Earth originated all at the same time. There was one common ancestor that then gave rise to everybody. And he has a great book called The Language of God, in which he talks about the fact that how inspiring that is to know that we're not separate from the other living things. We are as connected to every other living thing as we are to our own families. We are all from the same source. That's a beautiful thought to me. So that's another example of a guy who does this bioinformatics. Beth Shapiro studies mutations in RNA viruses and in bisons. By studying those mutations, she can figure out which viruses will survive, which bison will survive. Jennifer McCoy in Ireland studies these mutations in pine species in fossils of pine, using evolution to tell what happened to these, caused some of them to live and some of them not to live. And she can accurately figure out the ages of those fossils very, very well, using a number of different dating techniques, most of which Ken Ham and creationists say, no, it's not possible, because remember that periodic table of the elements I showed you earlier? They're not in favor of that. They don't really like that periodic table. They don't like the way it works very well. This is a place that I work. Sometimes I'm on the advisory board for the Human Origins Project at the Smithsonian. They have lots of different fossil humans on display, and using forensic techniques, forensic anthropology, you can sort of recreate, by applying facial muscles and skin, you can recreate what those ancient human ancestors might have looked like. This gives you some ideas of who's who in our family tree. And what I ask students to do is look at skulls and measure them and make a decision on their own. Which ones do you think are human? Which ones do you think are not human? And that is a great way to get kids to argue with each other. By the way, if you can get ninth graders to argue with each other about skulls and not about girlfriends and boyfriends and, are the Pittsburgh Pirates going to win the series? I mean, come on. This is an amazing thing to think about. And it's an amazing story that our species has had. I don't know where it's going to go in the future, but we can tell a little bit about our past based on I think it's approximately 6,500 fossil humans that we know about that have been found so far. We don't have a lot of fossils, unfortunately. If you go to the Smithsonian website, you can actually click on this. Ken Ham thinks this is a bunch of baloney. All this Smithsonian stuff is just crazy. But we can see who we're closely related to, 3 different types of humans all alive at the same time, for example. And then these guys, they didn't make it. That branch didn't go very far, you see. So, let me show you a pretty picture. I think I'll end with that one. So, sometimes you can't go very far in arguments with people who don't think this is possible. And I don't like making people angry, although it certainly has happened. I have been called a number of things, which next week I will reveal to you. I have a PowerPoint slide with a list of all the different things. It's not rated R, don't worry. But I have a list of all the things people have called me because I challenged their faith commitment in their opinion. I was asked by a reporter when I showed up to testify at a school board meeting in Cobb County. The reporters waiting outside asked me, how do you respond to your enemies who say that evolution did not take place? And I was absolutely stunned by the question because of the word enemy. I was perfectly ready to answer most questions, but that one, I just dropped my jaw because what I realized at that moment is that a lot of people in that audience that I just spoke to don't think of me as a peer. They think of me as an enemy attacking them. And I had no intention of attacking anyone personally. What I was looking for is the appropriate way to teach science in a classroom. And my school board was monkeying around with my ideas. So I didn't like that. That's what the next talk will be about next week. It'll be about that very thing. We're a little bit past our time, but I can, yes?
You said that some of the creationists object to the periodic table.
Yes, ma'am.
In what way, in what rationale?
Big thing that they disagree with is the what are called radionuclides. They list on the periodic table of the element the rate of decay of various radioactive atoms. And they say that it may be true that that's the way that things happen now, but we can't be sure that's the way it happened in the 1600s, or that's the way it happened in the BC times, or however back you want to go, that it might just be incredibly variable, just all over the place. And what scientists show is a graph. I don't have a chalkboard, so I can't draw it, but a graph, very smooth, curved graph showing the decay of all these atoms. Uranium turning into thorium, turning into lead as it loses neutrons and so forth, and turning into a different element. And you can actually figure out, oh look, there's That lead is in that rock. That's the kind of lead that only comes from the decay of uranium atoms. So we know more or less how old that particular rock is, for example. If we saw a graph that sort of goes like this, then we would say, oh boy, that's unpredictable. We don't know how these radionuclides decay. But that's not what we see. We see very smooth curves on all of the radioactive elements on the periodic table. And therefore we sort of guess that that's probably how it worked in the past. So Ken Ham is an example of a creationist who likes to, what he really wants to do is change the definition of science. And he wants to call science like this, he wants to call it historical science. And historical science is sort of a, backroom kind of science. It's not really good science. And I have a picture that I'll show next week of a forensic examination of a crime scene. If we can't use science to detect things that happened in the past, 5 weeks ago, 5 years ago, 5 centuries ago, our science isn't very good, but we can. We can actually solve crimes that were a long time ago. So using forensic data, using data from radionuclides, we can tell how old things are. When I work with the people at the Smithsonian, they don't use just one dating technique to date these very valuable fossils that they find. They use several different techniques and see if they agree with one another. And if they do, then they say, okay, we think we have it right. So it's sad that they want to reject the periodic table of the elements. Anything else before refreshments? Hey.
How do you explain the timeline of the Old Testament versus...
Oh, like you're talking about Genesis 1, Genesis. Genesis actually has 2 creation stories, and they don't exactly match one another. There's a guy named Isaac Asimov, you might have heard of, who wrote a very good explication of how the first Genesis timeline doesn't exactly match the second Genesis timeline. And then there's another creation story that shows up in Job. And there is a professor named William Brown at Columbia Seminary, there we go. And he wrote he wrote a book all about the Job creation story, in which he describes how that fits in with modern science. And in general, the sort of general overall view is that it doesn't exactly match what we think of as science. For example, the first Genesis story talks about days. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Ken Ham would say those are 24-hour days. But the word day doesn't always mean the same thing to me. So I like to ask people, so what do you think the word day meant back in the day? Did it mean the same thing that we mean now when we say the word day? Could the word day be changed to have a different definition at any time? So I look at the Genesis story as being a problem of interpretation. It's the way I interpret it might not be the same way that you interpret it or the way that Ken Ham interprets it. Ken Ham is going with tick-tock, 24 hours, and I'm not. What the Genesis story says to me, what it says to me, is that without a doubt, God's universe is God's. He made it. It belongs to Him. And look at what He gave us. Look at all the miracles that He gave us. The miracle of day and night, the miracle of moon and stars, the miracle of oceans and crawling creatures on the land. That's what I see when I read. Genesis to me is a celebration. It's not a scientific document. It's really close to me to being music. It's almost like a song that somebody is singing to celebrate all the diversity. Look at all of our family tree. To celebrate all of the diversity on the earth that we see right now. So that's a different way of interpreting Genesis from the way that our friend Ken Ham might interpret it. By the way, there's a great book. I've got a list here different things that you might want to look at, different books and different. I still use books. I don't know if you do. This is a book you might want to look at to answer your very question. This is called Honest to Genesis, A Biblical and Scientific Challenge to Creationism by a woman. I actually met her and she signed my book. Margaret Gray Town is a professor of religion in Nevada. And that's got to be an interesting job. Her husband is a Presbyterian minister, and she's been a Presbyterian elder and on session at her church for a long time. But she claims that the problem with creationism, they're not looking at Genesis the right way. That's her claim, and I will like it. So I've got these things on the table here that you can pick up, document all about resources that you can use. I can pass them around. I'm good at that. Okay? So, Margaret, you want to?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely.